Hey guys, let me introduce today's interview featuring Bill Lewis, former Nebraska All-American and NFL center, brought to you by JD Sports Academy. We hope you enjoy today's episode. Good morning, this is John Davis welcoming you to another session of For the Good of the Game. Bill Lewis was an All-American center and captain as a senior in 1985 at the University of Nebraska and was drafted by the Los Angeles Raiders in the 7th round with the 191st overall pick. He played for the Raiders, the Phoenix Cardinals, and the New England Patriots. During his career, he had some time in the Canadian Football League as well after that. And we are exceptionally pleased and really happy to have Bill Lewis on the show today. Bill, thanks for being here. Really appreciate
John,
it.
great to see you.
Yeah, awesome.
Good to have you in town.
It's good to be back. The weather here certainly beats where we came from, that's for sure. What I'd like to do is kind of open up with an opportunity to focus on building the process as a player from the perspective of someone who's played at the highest level, starting a little bit when you did in youth league and working your way up through school, high school, ultimately at Nebraska and then into the NFL, and kind of talk about, just encapsulate that journey as far as when you sit here now today looking as a former NFL player playing at the highest level, what lessons learned or things that you went through would you want to share with someone if I were a 14 to 18-year-old kid sitting here? So kind of the Bill Lewis perspective of growing up with football as a pursuit.
Well, I'm pretty sure you feel the same way about the game, that you were attached to the game from an early age as a fan.
Absolutely.
And so was I. That's what captured me. I loved watching the game of football when I was little. Of course, my dad had played some college football at Morningside College in Sioux City, Iowa, but he left that to go into boxing, and at one point was ranked 10th in the heavyweight division. So
wow.
I guess it was a pretty good decision. But I got introduced to the game through my dad and just absolutely fell in love with it. And when I started playing, it was because I had a great passion for it. And, for me to get to football practice, we didn't have organized football in the public school system in Sioux City until you were into junior high school. So I was 12 years old in 7th grade, and that was the first time that, again, was going to get to play organized football. And that was actually the first year that we had youth football in Sioux City. And so I can remember the coach coming out the first day of practice and said, "Hey, I don't believe in warming up or calisthenics or conditioning." I'm like, this is beautiful. We're just going to line up and run plays. And we were terrible the whole year. Then the next year we got a coach that was real serious about it and real serious about actually teaching you how to play and the fundamentals and so forth. And, that changed the dynamic considerably. And I think with everybody that starts out playing football, if you go back to, what it's like, it's rough to be out there and buckle that chin strap and line up with your hand in the ground across from somebody, and then they say, hut, and you got to come off, and boom, there's this contact. There's that apprehension. Whether you want to admit it or not, to your buddies, to yourself, there's a lot of apprehension about what that's like. And I always tell people that football is built on a foundation of failures. Because
it's a great way to look at it.
You're going to get your butt kicked a lot. You're going to do a lot of things wrong and a lot of things poorly, especially as an offensive lineman, because the demand for you to be in good physical condition, to have a great core strength, is those types of things are going to be prerequisites to your success, because you won't be able to be in the bend. You won't be able to be in a good position to strike your opponent if you don't have those basic things. And I didn't have those basic things. And so it was a struggle for me. I spent a lot of time getting my butt kicked when I started out.
It's interesting that you say that, because one of the things along the journey of For the Good of the Game that I want to get into is the value of specific coaching. And we see a lot of, this has come up in conversations with other coaches, and we see a lot of it. You and I touched on it to some degree just recently when we met and we're chatting about the training and warm-up process.
Right.
But having someone that knows what they're doing from an X's and O's standpoint is great. But having someone that can look at the safety piece and look at the value of training. So today you see a lot of specialization, and that's one of the things that just drives me crazy is football coach in high school comes to young Bill Lewis and says, "Hey, Bill, you're a great athlete. We need you to train all off season. I don't want you to play basketball this fall. I don't want you to do wrestling." And that's totally 180 degrees counter from the way I look at it. What's your experience with regard to the value of other sports?
Well, you and I are very much in line there, John, because, I grew up, I played baseball, basketball, football, and I was out for track, in the spring. So my sports year never stopped. It just went from one to the next, all the way through high school. And so I think it's priceless for kids to play as many different sports as possible. Think about your body developing as a youngster, and who knows, how you're going to maximize your coordination. Is it going to happen because you're playing basketball and you're learning how to move your feet and defend to somebody? Is it going to happen in football as an offensive lineman, where it's a very similar motion?
Very good point.
I look at all these. I look at all the crossovers of different things. Even if you think about baseball and the complexity of throwing the baseball, the complexity of the shoulder joint to make sure that that's firing right. And I know more about this recently because I'm going through physical therapy trying to avoid another surgery, but I've got shoulder issues, but I'm training with a guy that's been a baseball guy for 30 years, and a Major League Baseball guy. And what I've learned already is it's fascinating, but it's also, what do I want to say? It also confirms what I believe about training guys. You must train the joints. You must get the joints strong. We take all these big kids. You see all these weight coaches, they get all excited about having these big kids that play in their offensive and defensive line, and they get them in the weight room and they want to see how much they can bench or how much they can squat. Why not teach them how to move? Why not teach them how to bend, all the way through a full range of motion without having little hitches in their body? And if you see little hitches, then they're not ready to put weight on their shoulders because they don't have the joint strength and the core strength to do that. So, train that first. We get ahead of ourselves with all of that.
I agree. And you haven't had the luxury of seeing guys like yourself and Dale Hillestray and Mouse McNally and guys that have not only played and or coached at the highest level. It's interesting to me because almost every coach that has that type of technique approach are the ones that I align with the quickest because I see the value in it. Obviously, for an offensive line coach, it's all about low man wins. It's about teaching leverage and how to control and move your feet and be able to strike and come back and so on and so forth. But I want to make a point to some of the parents that may see this. I think you're going to continue to hear this because a lot of the coaches that I have had the good fortune of developing friendships and relationships with as colleagues, it's a very common theme among guys that played at the highest level. Unlike you hear from a lot of high school and or middle school coaches nowadays, particularly in baseball and basketball with AAU and travel ball, you'll hear a lot of coaches say, no, they need to play year-round. You need to specialize. You need to get better. The reality is most of your former pro athletes and many of the Division I coaches who recruit heavily now, they say, I would rather have a kid that played multiple sports and played year-round. And I used to value as a coach to tell parents and players and take a break every once in a while.
Yes.
Take a week or two between seasons and rest your body and allow it to recover. When you finished – I want to kind of jump forward here a little bit, and because there's such a great history of tradition, in Nebraska. I mean, I don't care if you're a Nebraska fan or not.
Unfortunately, we have a generation that doesn't understand that now because that's how long it's been since we've been winning.
Well, but hopefully Scott Frost can help turn that around a little bit.
Believe, and for all the Cornhusker fans out there, stay true. I believe that Scott Frost will turn this thing around and he'll get it back to being Husker football.
I do too. I do too. But when you were there in going through that program, that's one of the premier programs that's steeped in tradition. What values did you take away from coaches and other players? Maybe when you were freshman or sophomore, a senior captain that imparted something to you, or a coach or assistant coach. What kind of things did you learn going through that process at a school like Nebraska that helped capitalize on what you learned both physically, emotionally, moving forward, that kind of put you in a position to succeed then going to the NFL?
Wow, I got to tell you, it was a shock when I went onto campus at Nebraska. I mean, I knew what I was getting into. I knew, and I wanted to go there. It was my first choice out of all the schools that recruited me. And the reason I wanted to go there is because I thought that would be my best shot at playing for a national championship was going to Nebraska.
Good point.
And I don't know that many guys make a decision about where they're going to school based on that, but that was, for better or for worse, that was my main criteria. So when I went to Nebraska in 1981, we had a separate freshman team. And we had 22 scholarship guys in my class, and we had 122 players on the freshman team. I was a center. I was the only scholarship offensive lineman that year. We were 9 deep on the depth chart at center.
Holy cow.
And the deal at Nebraska was center was the biggest position to play. it was the guy that played center was probably one of the most well-known guys on the team every year. And then it just so happened that was right when Dave Remington was coming into his own. So my freshman year, my redshirt year, Dave's winning the Outland a couple times in a row, kind of redefining the position. So that's what it was like walking in there, and you were treated the same whether you were a scholarship guy or a walk-on.
Wow.
Didn't matter.
That's great culture.
They were giving everybody an opportunity, and so obviously with only 22 scholarship guys, we had a whole bunch of walk-on guys playing.
Sure.
We had 3 walk-on in my class that turned down D1 scholarships to other schools to walk on at Nebraska.
Holy moly.
All 3 of them went on to be starters. 2 of them went on to be all Big 8 performers. 1 went on to be the orthopedic surgeon for the team. So, that was the culture at Nebraska. And the coolest thing at Nebraska every year was at the end of spring practice on the Friday before the spring game, Tom Osborne would call the team up, and we'd be practicing in spring football. We'd have 175 guys. And the program, John, the program was so well organized. I came back in 1995 after the end of the season when I was playing for the Memphis Mad Dogs of the Canadian Football League to a Tuesday practice in 1995. My last Tuesday practice was 1985, my senior year. That Tuesday practice was exactly the same as it was in 1985, down to the minute.
That's amazing.
That's how scheduled out everything was. And Tom Osborne and that coaching staff, they were so well organized. When we ran an inside run period and we had 17 plays, we had 14 minutes to run those 17 plays. Well, we actually ran 34 because we did it with the first team over here against the scout team, and then we did it with the second team over here against the scout team. And they just went back and forth. And so it was organized. It was, you were drilled and disciplined, and you were graded on the fundamentals, on the footwork, on where your hat was, and where your hands were. You got that sense and that attention to detail, or you decided it wasn't worth it. I loved the attention to detail.
Absolutely.
And I'm such a believer in fundamentals. I know that fundamentals beat strength and power all the time. If you master the fundamentals, you will enjoy the game, especially as an offensive lineman. And so, so going through that program, those were the kinds of things that happened. So I go back to that Friday before the spring game. Tom Osborne had called the team up, and they would have usually 3 to 5 scholarships available for guys that they were going to, either recruit out of junior college, or they were going to give scholarships to guys that had earned it, that were walk-ons. And it's, to this day, it's the coolest thing that you'll ever see, and I get goosebumps just talking about it.
I can see.
Because, there are so many guys that busted their butt to get there, to be a part of the program. And even when you were a scholarship guy on the varsity, hey, if there was a kid that was pushing to get playing time and he was a walk-on, he got out there and played better than you did, guess what? He was going to be playing.
That's awesome.
And that's how it should be. You know?
I agree.
So you learn that. And I don't know that exists anymore in a lot of places.
Well, it gets back to what we were talking about, off camera when we got together for breakfast recently. The whole process, and it blows my mind, the example you gave, and we'll get to a little bit about what your son Alex is doing here in a minute. But I'm such a believer, and I've changed my whole focus. I mean, I grew up in an era where you went out and you loosened up for maybe 10, 15 minutes,
right.
ran a few gassers before to kind of get your blood flowing, but you were doing things like, cherry pickers before you were even stretched out, where you ran more risk of pulling a hamstring than you did about stretching that hamstring out. And now I've gone 180 degrees to where when I trained athletes from high school up through pro athletes, it was about the dynamic range of motion. It was about, as you talked about, protecting joints, strengthening the ligaments or not ligaments, but the muscle structure and the movement structure around those joints. So you get greater leverage throughout the range of motion, and now you become a more effective football player. So when you look at that type of thing, and with that culture you talked about, falling back on that experience, what did you see when you first got to the Raiders? And I'm not saying to bash anybody. I mean, what did you see when you juxtapose your experience at Nebraska and that level of detail and focus on fundamentals? Did you have an expectation going into the NFL after you were drafted at what you would see, and how did that match what you went through?
It's interesting because I think that there was a reality check for me at every level. I mean, I went through high school football. I never lettered in any sport till my senior year in football.
Interesting.
And then I was an all-state center. But a lot of that was a little bit political with the coach that I had and that kind of stuff. And I thought, well, okay, now that I'm going to college football and they're doing this for real, the politics is gone. Well, you know what? The politics is greater at that level, and so you think, well, that's because it's college. But now you're going to the NFL and they're paying you. That's not going to be. Oh no, it's even worse. Even so, you got to develop the ability at all of those levels to turn off the noise and focus on the things that are under your control. And with all my guys that I work with today, including my son, who I remind him of this every week, there are only two controllables in life: attitude and effort. Own those. Don't allow anybody to come in there and take those away from you. Don't say, well, so-and-so did this to me, that's why I did this. No, you chose to do that after so-and-so did this. Don't give me that. It's attitude and effort. And so it was disappointing coming into the NFL because they were the old school Raiders, They weren't anywhere near the attention to detail that we were at Nebraska.
Mm-hmm.
And they didn't practice that way, and you couldn't practice that way because, you only have 45 guys back then on the roster. Of course, Al always stashed 20 guys on IR that always ended up practicing. But, so small rosters and big egos, and they had won a bunch. A bunch of the guys on the team had won, an older team. But it was a great experience coming in there because we had some guys that were just phenomenal pros. I mean, absolutely some of the best pros that I've ever been around. Howie Long, probably the brightest guy that I ever played football with, and probably the greatest student of the game.
Interesting. I mean, I certainly respect him as a commentator. That's great. That's great insight to hear that as a player.
I would say that he studies more than anybody I've ever been around. I can remember my rookie year. We're getting ready to play the Chargers in the first game, and he's leaving the building on Monday, and he's got this huge stack of videotapes. Back then we were still doing VHSs. I think he had the beta machine, so you could run it back, and it was a little better quality. I'm like, well, what are you doing? He goes, I'm going to do my film break. I'm going to do my breakdowns on the team. I said, well, we're going to get the computer printouts on Wednesday. He goes, yeah, I don't trust those. I do my own. And
wow.
And he could tell you, Howie could tell you about when he was playing. He could tell you who every offensive coordinator was. He could tell you what personnel groups he liked, where he liked those groups on the field, what down and distance situations, when the guy would take shots, when he would take chances. He knew. And he knew what our offense was going to do before we ever snapped the ball. You could be standing next to him in practice, and he would just call the plays.
And so I want to make a point here that because I was recently chatting with Wes Chandler, former San Diego Charger great, and who was inducted into the Florida Hall of Fame here about a year and a half, 2 years ago. He made the point, we were talking about great guys that we knew to interview. And, all the folks that I'm going to interview as a function of For the Good of the Game are going to be guys that I think share mindedness with me in terms of my experience. And many of them I learned that from over the years that I've known them. But one of the things that you hear consistently is about the attention to detail, the old school student of the game approach, which unfortunately you don't see a lot in the younger guys playing today, either in college or at the NFL level.
Right.
Now, I can't speak obviously to the NFL level. I haven't been there, but my experience in college is it's that percentage of guys that take that level of approach haven't grown up through systems like that, so they don't have that attitude to carry forward unless they're just an exception or their parents have intervened. So it's good to hear you say that because I know that many older players do. So I want to go back just a second and talk a little bit.
Can I interrupt
absolutely,
you though? Because I mentioned Howie Long, but I'd be remiss if I didn't mention several other guys who are also phenomenal pros. Mike Haynes, cornerback, just absolutely one of the best pros I've ever been around. Would come and ask me about offensive line schemes so that he could understand more about what he was doing.
Wow.
Van McElroy was the same way. Matt Millen was the same way. The toughest and most passionate player I ever played with was Marcus Allen.
Interesting.
And totally a student of the game. All of these guys loved the game, absolutely loved the game, and really knew the game. And so that's what I try to impart to my guys. That's an opportunity for everybody. that ability to get in there and learn as much as you can, and realize that as long as you play the game, you never arrive. It's like Vince Lombardi used to say, it's a journey, not a destination.
Absolutely.
As soon as you treat it like a destination, your destination is determined. You're on your way out.
Well, I've had the good fortune of training with some guys that have worked with Olympians, for instance, and when you get into that level of competition, one of the things, and it applies much to any professional sport and even for college, it's the 1% or the 1 degree of improvement that you can experience in the short term by taking that approach that over time adds up to you becoming the expert at what you do.
Right.
And to be the best, you have to take, in my humble opinion, you have to take that approach. It's not about ever getting to the destination. It's about who do you become as you try and pursue becoming better than you are right now.
Right.
And I think that encapsulates that thought. You said it best a minute ago. So as you look back on those types of things, as a dad, you said that you and your son Alex are, well, you said one of, recap for me, one of a small group.
I was told it was 4 families in the 133-year history of Nebraska football that have had a father and a son both be captain.
That's awesome. And when he was growing up, having obviously, played or playing at that time in the NFL, as Alex is growing up and seeing him develop, and we talked a little off camera about the weightlifting and things like that.
Right.
Right. But how did you use the experiences at Nebraska, at Los Angeles, or wherever, in your follow-on in your career, as you begin to watch him develop? I know for me it was always hard when my kids were the youngest and someone else was coaching them. It was oftentimes hard for me to keep my mouth shut. But that's just me. But what did you carry over and teach him, whether off the field or on, that you feel like helped him have a leg up, so to speak, because of his father's experience?
Well, early on when he was getting into sports, I did not coach him in any of the sports that he played. I went to every practice, went to every game, and all I coached was attitude and effort. That's all I coached in him. I'm like, look, if you're going to do this, you're going to do it with the right attitude, and you're going to do it with maximum effort all the time. And when you don't like what's going on, the coach isn't playing you or not playing you at the right spot, or you think something's going on, I don't care. When you're out there, I want maximum effort, and I want the best attitude that you could possibly have. Team first, make that sacrifice. Learn to be not just okay with making sacrifices. Learn to thrive on making sacrifices.
That's awesome. I know that for me, coaching my own kids was, I call it creating margin. As an active duty officer in the Army, it's very tough. You see a lot of people that struggle, even in the business world, to be able to spend time with their children if they're pursuing a career. And the Army's no exception, because you're basically, on call 24/7. So what I did was I incorporated our family time into my work experience, and I worked hard at that. And and my wife Julie would be very involved. But we would plan our practices when I was coaching my kids' teams to where I could leave and we'd do the practice where we were on the military installation, and then I would go back to work, and Mom would take the kids home. But we had quality time to spend together. And I love the fact that in the context of your experience with Alex, you coached the right things, and the focus was fundamentally on what he could control, and that way get better as you go through.
Well, and there were a million examples along the way for little kids, because it's all your buddies that are out there, and they're all, kids are going to be kids. They're going to act up. They're going to be upset. There's going to be that kid that's incredibly selfish, and he had a couple of those guys on his team, and so we got to discuss that as he was growing up. And then he was begging me to finally coach him, and so I did, John. But I told him, I said, be careful what you wish for. I said, I've been watching you since you started, and quite frankly, I said, you don't know if the ball's blowed up or stuffed up. I said, we got a long way to go if you want me to coach. So when he was a junior in high school, I coached the offensive and defensive lines his junior and senior year.
That's awesome. Yeah, I always kid my I've got 3 boys and a girl, and I kid my kids because I coached them all in every sport they played when I wasn't deployed. And I made a lot of mistakes on them. A lot of kids I coached after them benefited because I made a ton of mistakes on them. Even to the extent where, going out and having my kid shut down on me because I went to the huddle and grabbed his face mask and chewed him out, So I want to talk to you a little bit about, and as we get toward the end here and kind of wrap up, I've got a couple things I want to cover, but there's been a recent development in California. The House and Senate approved, and the governor signed into law and a rule now that is going to enable, starting in 2023, NCAA athletes who play at colleges in California are going to be able to accept compensation for their name, likeness, and a few other things. Basically, not necessarily on the level of endorsement deals, but there's a pay-for-play aspect that the NCAA has frowned on for years and prohibited, that California has said, well, we're going to do it anyway. Well, now the NCAA has flipped and said, okay, we're going to develop the possibility for any NCAA athlete to be able to do this. Not in play yet, not in practice, but just what's your initial reaction to having been obviously a very high-level Division I at a storied program like Nebraska going to the NFL? What's your reaction to that kind of thing and what it may do to football, on any level, good or bad?
I can see all kinds of things, both good and bad, happening from this process. If we supposedly live in a free market society, I think that you ought to be able to go market yourself and earn whatever you can while you're doing it, even if you are going to school on a scholarship, because quite frankly, being a scholarship athlete handicaps a lot of people because they can't go out and make money. They don't, until recently, they haven't even been giving them enough money to live on and go buy meals outside of whatever they serve at the training table for 10 meals a week. That just started happening when Alex was in his last year or two in school, that they bumped it up and started giving him money. So taking care of the athletes, literally, taking care of them, that would be a great start. Now, do you need to pay them and give them shoe deals? That's not going to happen, because who has the shoe contracts?
Yeah, exactly.
The university has and they're certainly not. If you're a Nike university, you're certainly not going to let your star player come out there and wear Adidas.
Right.
So how is that going to work? And in basketball, think about college basketball. You're either a Nike school or you're an Adidas school. What happens if one of your guys wants to? You can't even recruit kids that aren't Adidas kids, basically.
Yeah,
did you know that?
Because of conflict of interest.
Yes, that's what they basically stay with. So, I don't know. It's a very, very complex issue, and there is so much money at stake, and I just do not see the NCAA giving that money up.
It's interesting that you say that, because there are all kinds of pessimistic views. And in my opinion, the biggest downside is all of the wolves in sheep's clothing that begin to come out.
Exactly. You're going to bring a lot of bad news people into the process.
Because, it's already bad enough that you've got people going out, major college programs in basketball that offer kids in the 8th grade, for instance.
They're doing it in football, too.
Yeah. And
I had a kid in a Wisconsin camp who was in 6th grade, already had 5 D1 offers.
Oh, my goodness. I mean, God bless them if they've got that much natural talent. The problem that I see in two ways. One is that there will be a lot of parents that will be misled. Even if they want the best for their kids and they're not tempted by the money, they will be misled. And two, that will begin to create situations where, and this is the next thing I want to talk about, where a kid begins to believe the hype.
Yep.
And all of a sudden, that attitude and effort that he controls, which really get back to work ethic, all of a sudden he's all that in a bag of chips. And now what does he lose? The most critical capacity as you go forward as a professional athlete.
As a person.
As coachability.
Right.
And to me, that's the biggest downside of all this, is believing the hype, and all of a sudden a kid that has always been great and has the talent and has unlimited potential all of a sudden caps that potential himself or herself because they believe the hype and now they're not coachable. Well, coach, everybody else is saying that I'm going to be great. Why don't you get that? That's the biggest piece for me. And that's why I loved your approach with Alex as far as the attitude and effort. So, and it carries forward in everything you do in life. It doesn't matter whether it's sports or not. So
yeah, it really does. It carries over.
We talked about this a bit off camera when we got together last time, and I wanted to touch. And we don't have to go into the whole team situation. It just really. I guess I want to carry forward and make a point. We discussed the difference in the approaches that Alex experienced on the two teams that he's been on so far, being drafted by the Ravens and then now being traded to the Jets. And the approaches in terms of the warm-up process and how they approach. And obviously you expect it to be different based on the coaching staff of the game
There's
approach.
always going to be variations in that stuff.
How valuable do you see that as a guy who trains athletes now? How valuable do you see that the culture that is inculcated with that approach, regardless of where you are. It's just interesting that you brought the point up with Alex because you guys had talked about it. It surprised me, quite frankly, that at the NFL level there was that big a stark difference. But how do you see that as somebody that trains athletes and coaches kids?
I think it's just part of the evolution of the thought of training, and I think that we've come so far. And getting a chance to work every year with guys that are getting ready for the combine and college all-star games, that's really helped my perspective on coaching as well, because you see kids come in with all these physical imbalances because they only played on the left side in college, or you only played on the right side, and suddenly they don't move laterally very well, and they can't pull the other way because they train their bodies into an imbalance.
That's interesting.
And why wouldn't we as coaches be cognizant of that and make sure that we are keeping those kids training both ways so that they don't train to an imbalance.
Absolutely.
And then put themselves at greater risk of injury. And so I'm learning a lot about all of those types of things, but really I think the biggest one is the way we warm up. And, we used to have a 10-minute stretching routine with Nebraska after we jogged around the field a couple of times, and that was how we warmed up. Well, now you don't static stretch to warm up.
Right.
You static stretch when you're done working out. It's all this dynamic movement stuff, and that's a game-changing dynamic, and it needs to be there every time these guys get on the field and go train. And so it's great to see that the Jets take that approach where there's a 20-minute warm-up period with 4 different stations to get the body ready to go just to practice, and that kind of stuff makes sense. And they do it a lot down at Fisher's where I train guys, and that approach, I think, is keeping guys healthier.
Yeah, I do too. And it's interesting because, former NFL wide receiver Don Beebe's got the House of Speed.
Yeah.
I learned a little bit of that from him personally, watching him loosen up. And then you've got Bill Parisi speed schools that do a lot of that kind of thing. And until I got into that and learned, and parents or coaches, if you haven't started looking into or learning dynamic range of motion, DROM warm-ups, please do so. Do your athletes a favor and learn.
Most definitely.
Learn the dynamic range of motion, because nowadays the reality is you better prepare from a warm-up and injury prevention standpoint by dynamic range of motion and save that static stretching for your cool down so that your muscles cool down properly and you don't lose range of motion. Bill, I wanted to go into one other area before I get to kind of my last piece. And that is when you look at the guys you train now, that whether it's for the combine or in preparation for anything that they're going to do in their careers, whether it be at college or pro, what do you see from experience? And you've touched on this a little bit, and that's why I made a note. I wanted to come back to it. What do you see from experience that is lacking from the standpoint of a fundamentals approach, particularly as an offensive lineman or as a center specifically, that you would share with anybody who is currently anywhere on the offensive line, whether they're center, right or left guard, tackle, whatever, that they should make sure that if they haven't been taught or coached on it, that they need to go out and seek coaching on this particular fundamental technique?
Well, I think it starts long before you work on fundamentals. It starts with your core strength. All offensive linemen need to work hard on core strength. And think about it, John. All of us are bigger people. So as we're growing up, we've got this massive growth growing. Think about when you reached your coordination. When do you think that was? 20, 21?
Yeah, probably my early to mid-college years.
Yeah. Well, for most big guys, it's probably not till you're close to 30, because your body is just catching up, all that growth, and then bringing all that coordination back into it. And then if you're piling on weight as an offensive lineman and trying to pile on strength and balance and coordination, all of that stuff takes a long time to really get there. And if you don't have the core strength to start with, you will never even come close to maximizing your abilities. Never even close. And it's something that I harp on my son about all the time. I get NFL Game Pass, so I watch all of his tapes. And just little things in it's your stance. If you can't get in a good stance, then I know you're not somebody that's into the fundamentals. If you don't have a really good stance as an offensive lineman, I can watch you get in a stance, and I know what your attitude is. I know what your level of commitment is. I know it's at least inconsistent if the stance is bad.
That's a great point.
So if you can't get into a stance, then that's where we're going to start. We're going to build everything off of that. I'm going to teach guys how to get in a stance, how to live in the bend. Then I'm going to teach them to move in the bend. And we're going to do all kinds of, different little things like bands and balls. They have that exercise ball between their legs, bands around their ankles, be working laterally, be working vertically. A bunch of different things to help develop the stability in all of those joints so that they can bend. So they don't have to think about that. Because what happens is, for offensive linemen, if you don't have good core strength, then your spine tends to get a curve in it. And so when your spine has a curve in it and you go to hit somebody, you crumble. But if your spine is like this and it's solid, wham, now you are the hammer. Here, you are just the receiver because you're in a bad angle and you're going to get injured that way. And you get that way because your core is not strong. So I would much rather see people, especially young guys, start out, master the core. Why was J.J. Watt 3-time Defensive Player of the Year? In my opinion, it's because his core was just phenomenal. It was so off the charts.
Great point.
He was so explosive, so in command of all that. Now he's had some other injuries along the way that may be tied to other things, but boy, when he was on top of it, you could just see it. When you look at Aaron Donald, you can see that his core is so ridiculously strong that he's outrageously explosive. He's maximizing his abilities. Offensive linemen, I don't think are really taught to do that, and that's an emphasis that I like to put on my guys right now.
That's awesome. And we tend to hear that phrase all the time. Oh, that dude's a freak of nature. Well, you don't, whether you are or not. You don't just survive for a career in college and then the NFL on being a freak of nature. It's got to be fundamentals and that conditioning that allows you to maximize that natural genetic, ability, if you will.
Well, I got one of those freaks of nature at the University of Washington right now. And
really?
He's about 6'8", 326 pounds.
Wow.
He's currently playing right guard, but he is a master of the fundamentals.
That's awesome.
And he's a redshirt sophomore, and he may be one of the best linemen in the country right now.
That's awesome. I love hearing that kind of stuff. I see it, it's a shame, and you see it all the time, and I think a lot of parents don't necessarily maybe they haven't ever been exposed to it, so they don't see it. When you have a kid that matures early, there's a process that was labeled some years ago LTAD, long-term athletic development, and Canadians, particularly hockey, the sport of hockey, has tracked it and done it much more gracefully than we have here.
Because they start earlier.
Exactly. And you've got kids that, because when sports go with like a U12, U13 and so on, the kids who are born early in that year develop longer for that same age than the kid born in November or December.
Makes sense.
And we have never really taken a chance to do that. So when you get a kid in the States, my experience is a kid that maybe is a freak of nature in the 8th grade or as a sophomore, because he has matured faster than those kids his age physically. Unfortunately, what you see a lot of times is by the time they get out of high school or when they get into college, they fade away because they have maximized their potential for where they were and didn't have that coaching to really say, hey, if you get good at fundamentals, you can perpetuate your success, but you've got to work at it. It's not going to happen because they've always just played to the best of their ability.
Yep.
What I want to do, Bill, is go through and this really isn't, I called it the 2-minute drill because of the focus on football, but it's not necessarily that we're limited to 2 minutes. But I'd like to go through just a series of random questions that I plan to ask everybody. And they're not necessarily, they're in and out of sports, in and out of football. But going back through just to kind of cue, and I like to have an end spot before we get to my final question that I can kind of gauge as we go through each of these interview periods of asking everybody kind of the same group of questions and seeing the difference. What would you say, given in any sport, not just football, was what first comes to mind when you say your favorite youth sports memory growing up?
I love playing Little League Baseball. That was one of my favorite games to play. And I was a catcher, so I was involved in every pitch. And my brother John, a year older than I was, he was our number one pitcher.
Awesome.
And then we had a kid named Lonnie Cruz who was the number 2 pitcher. And we got into the postseason. We were a 6-10 regular season team. The 3 teams that were at the top of our division were 16-0, 14-2, 12-4. Out of the 128 teams in Sioux City that year, they finished first, second, and third. We went all the way to 8th.
Wow.
And we were a 6-10 team, and we beat a 16-0 team.
Awesome.
Yeah, that was still, back then, Little League, that was the coolest thing going. I should probably say, though, in case my mom sees this, that it was all my time in T-ball because my mom was our coach.
Oh, okay. It started with the fundamentals of great coaching that Mom laid out.
She takes credit for everything.
That may be another reason why we connect on that level, because I too wore the tools of ignorance growing up, and so did my youngest son. So that's interesting. If you have one, or if you could isolate one, whether it be in a bowl game or a routine, do you have maybe a favorite play from your college career at Nebraska that stands out? Whether it was necessarily a play you were, instrumental in or not, do you have a play that necessarily stands out in your mind as one of a handful?
Well, I mean, there was a whole season of them in 1983 when we had the scoring explosion with Turner Gill, Irving Fryer, and Mike Rose. It was just phenomenal to be a part of that. And I was a backup, and I was actually the third team center that year, and I played enough to let her.
Wow. So you guys were scoring.
So that was pretty cool. And I guess if there's one moment from actually playing, it would have been, I don't know why this play sticks in my mind, but we were on the 14-yard line, and our own 14-yard line at the beginning of the game. We lined up, ran fullback trap up the middle against Florida State in the opener, and they were playing a 3-4 defense, and we comboed, ace blocked the nose tackle to the backside backer. Brian Blankenship pulled and just destroyed the linebacker, and Tom Rathman went right up the middle, untouched, 86 yards for a touchdown.
Wow.
That one kind of stuck out, and I'm like, man, that Rathman can really run.
Well, you know what, and that's a great point, because for all those offensive linemen out there, I just recently posted on my For the Good of the Game website an article that had been done saying that offensive linemen are the smartest people and the smartest group of guys in football. And to your point, you were making the comment about Howie Long earlier and some of the other guys that you played with. I think that a lot of people, whether you subscribe to the endearing term big uglies or not, whether you're talking about offensive or defensive line, I think a lot of people don't realize how instrumental. And when they see, fill in the blank with any great running back, break through the line, somebody made that hole. He didn't get there by himself, especially not with the level at major college and pro football that guys play at the second level. So I love the fact that you brought that up. That's Rathman, I'm sure, appreciates it too. Favorite non-football activity?
Golf.
Okay.
Yeah.
You playing a lot lately, or?
I have not been able to because of some physical issues, but I'm working hard on the physical therapy stuff to get back to it.
Well, if I said I was anything but a duffer, I'd be lying, but I love the game of golf. So,
I do too.
If you had one that you could single out, and you've already talked about a number of the guys that you were blessed to play with, was there one guy that stands out as far as a best NFL teammate on any of the teams you played on?
Oh, I'd still have to say it was Marcus Allen.
Marcus, okay.
For a guy that was, when you walked into the locker room, when I walked into the locker room for the first time in 1986 after being drafted by the Raiders, and I saw Marcus Allen, there was just this sense that was an iconic figure standing there, not just your teammate. That this guy had a larger than life presence about him. But boy, when you got on the field, he loved to practice. He loved to learn everything that was going on up front. He would come to me. We're getting ready to play the Bears in Chicago, and they had that nasty defense. And they'd jump into the bear look, and Hampton would come over the center. Marcus is begging me all week long. He goes, Lou, when Hampton jumps in there, he says, you got to let him go ball side. I'm like, well, I'm not going to let him go ball side. He goes, you got to let him go ball side and let me get a shot on him. He says, you can get your left hand on him, but get out of the way and let me hit him. And, he's my size. I'm talking about Hampton. He's 6'7", and he was, 315 pounds or something. So the first time they jump into that defense, Marcus is hollering at me, and I just, Lou. And I said, I got it. So I let him go ball side, and I get my left hand on his shoulder. Marcus hits him so hard that he lands on the back of his helmet on the yard line, and it whites out his name on the back of his jersey, and his right foot comes up and kicks me under the chin and splits my chin open.
Holy cow.
That's how hard he hit. And he was like out on the ground, and Marcus is standing over him, and he's kind of coming around after about 5 seconds, and he kind of realizes, and I'm like, who the hell was that? And I was like, Marcus is like, what's up, big man? And the rest of the game, he didn't come hard once. It was the easiest game I ever played in the NFL.
That's crazy.
And Marcus did that to no less than a dozen defensive linemen in the 4 years that I played with him.
That's awesome.
Awesome. So a guy that is that iconic of a player, loves the details, loves to be a part of the team, helping the team out any way he could. When we got Bo Jackson, Marcus went to fullback.
Exactly.
Bo's 5'10", 245. Marcus is 6'3", 210 pounds soaking wet. And here he is playing fullback, and probably at the time was the toughest fullback in the league.
That's excellent. That's excellent. Outside of football, favorite movie if you have one?
Favorite movie? It has to be Caddyshack.
Oh, that's a good one.
Yeah,
I like that.
yeah.
I like that.
And the worst movie? Caddyshack 2.
Yeah. Not everyone is necessarily a raving success as a piece of art.
Exactly.
Yeah. Sometimes it's just
exactly.
Sometimes you just
There's
got
not
to be
a Mona
goofy.
Lisa too, is there?
That's right. That's right. That's right. If you have one at any level, favorite coach or coaches?
Boy, I got a bunch. Cletus Fisher when I was at Nebraska. Del Hughes when I was in high school. Alex Gibbs. John Matsko. And then not necessarily close with the head coaches, but played for a lot of great head coaches. Had a good relationship with Bill Parcells. Really enjoyed my time around him. But yeah, there were a lot of good influences along the way.
It's interesting because I don't know if now that I mentioned when I was going through the lineup but Alex Gibbs, I was watching him train some athletes in Arizona, and I'd never watched him at that level before. And it really opened my eyes to just the depth of his experience watching him in that situation. Unbelievable.
The man that's the brightest football coach that I've ever been around.
That's awesome. That's awesome. If you have one, is there a particular greatest NFL game memory that necessarily jumps out in your mind?
Wow. No, I don't know that I have any one. I mean, there were some pretty cool moments, but I never in my career never made it to the postseason, and so we were with the Raiders. All we had to do is win one of our last 3 games in 3 different years, and we didn't do it. So we didn't make the postseason there, and obviously with the Cardinals we weren't close back in the early '90s. But I knew New England was going to be good. I went there in '93 when we drafted Bledsoe, and liked what they were doing. Knew it wasn't going to be long, but my body was breaking down and saying it's about time for you to be done.
Well, and I certainly can appreciate that, and have gone through the same thing. With my athletic career, albeit short and sweet. I tell my kids now, the older I get, the better I was. I'm at that stage of my career, but I can appreciate that approach. As a kind of a final thought, final question, anything, and you can go wherever you want to go. If you were going to talk to anyone, be it your younger self or Alex, your son, or any other young person that maybe you train, under the mindset or the attitude of for the good of the game, looking forward on the future of football, I absolutely love the whole 2 most important things you control is attitude and effort. And I love that because I taught my kids growing up, you win or you learn. And when you lose, that's when you learn. And that's what allows you to grow and get better. But for the good of the game can encompass a lot of things. It can be the kind of thing you talked about, the lack of selfishness of a Marcus Allen, switching to fullback when you had Bo, or someone that taught you along the way. What type of attitude or lessons learned would you have for the good of the game to impart upon the younger Bill or a son Alex, or to a kid that you might train today?
Yesterday I was online and I was reading the scouting report or this scouting website, and I can't remember what coach or what GM came out and said this, but I thought it was somewhat prophetic, and that he talked about in evaluating players that the tape gives you the floor, the character defines the ceiling.
I love that.
And so when just the stuff I was talking about with Marcus Allen, if you looked at the tape of him when he was at USC, obviously he was awesome. He was a Heisman Trophy winner, a great player, but that defines the floor. That's what he is. But it's the character that defines the ceiling, and that's what made him phenomenal. That's what made him great. That's why he's a Hall of Famer. So it's the choices you make every day, and it's. I think for a lot of kids it can be so overwhelming because coaches can be so intense and want to get right up in your face and tell you this is how it is, and boy, you gotta have this kind of commitment. You need to be in here in the weight room. You need to be vested in this. I would just say, with whatever you're going to do, I would tell myself, my younger self, go find out what you're passionate about and pursue it. And that's what I did tell myself when I was young. I wanted to go pursue things that I was passionate about. And I was passionate about playing football. And I didn't tell a lot of people that I planned on playing in the NFL when I was in high school, because they would have thought I was pretty nuts because I didn't even letter until I was a senior. But I was planning on playing in the NFL when I was in high school.
That's awesome.
It was my passion. And so what I learned to do through people like my brother and his friends, who were all a year older than me, and they were all into getting into working out and so forth, it was just one step at a time. You start adding one little thing in here, changing this little habit, getting up in the morning, a little bit earlier. When you're a kid, it's easy to sleep in. Just get out of bed when mom and dad are tired of screaming at you, throw your clothes on, and away you go to school. Well, it's a different thing when you decide that now you're going to get up early and
Absolutely.
go to school and decide to work out. So by the time I was going into my senior year, I made the decision as a junior not to play basketball and not to go out for a winter sport. Now that pissed the basketball coach off, and it pissed the wrestling coach off. I would come into study hall, and there would be a wrestling singlet and wrestling shoes with a note about practice time and stuff.
Little hint.
Yeah, a little hint. But I never did that. And so they wouldn't let us use the weight room after school because, well, that's for the sports. Even though they weren't using it, it was like a little bit of. So we made one of the assistant football coaches get up there at 5:00 so we could lift weights before school.
Awesome.
And myself and one of my buddies would run to school 3 times a week. I lived 3.5 miles from school, in Iowa. It was pretty nasty when you got a snowmobile suit on and a big old backpack with your clothes and your books and trudging to school. But, those were choices you made. Those were choices because this is what I wanted to do. I wanted to play football. And I wanted to do it at the next level, and I wanted to do it at the professional level. And I was fortunate to go to a high school where I had a whole bunch of buddies that were all of the same ilk. We had 17 kids off my high school football team get scholarships.
Wow, that's impressive.
5 guys got D1 scholarships.
That's awesome.
4 guys from my high school team have kids that play in the league.
Wow. It would be interesting to research that. I'll bet you that's not a very common occurrence.
No.
Not at all.
No.
That is really cool. I think that and something that, just a general comment that I've made and after I heard it is, as a way of looking at life, we are, wherever we are now, each of us is essentially the sum of all the decisions that we've made up to that point. And one of the things that I want to thank you for bringing up, because I think it's and it's something that I'm going to steal and use. A lot of people say, learn to control what you can control. But I love the focus on the 2 things you can control the most readily, and that is your attitude and your effort. And you're not the first person necessarily that has spoken about either of those individually or maybe even collectively together. But I think that you put it very eloquently in terms of how it was worked into your frame of mind working out, how you looked at coaching your son off the field before you got on the field to coach him. And I want to thank you for that personally and professionally, because I think it's something that people need to hear from folks that have gone through the process and the journey that you have, and that have also, in this case, have a son that has been as successful to play as Alex has with the Jets, or Ravens and Jets. So thanks a ton for being here, for bringing up a lot of awesome knowledge, and I hope that you guys gained something out of this as well. So Bill, thanks very much. I really
John,
appreciate
thanks
your
for
time.
having me.
It was awesome. Thanks a lot.